Hello, this is Gretchen Baskerville, the author of The Life-Saving Divorce. Today I'm interviewing Sheila Gregoire, an award-winning Christian marriage author and daily blogger at her blog to love, honor, and vacuum.com, one of the largest marriage blogs in North America. Last year, she conducted the largest ever study to date of Christian women's marital and sexual satisfaction. Today, she's going to share her startling findings that many of the messages in evangelical marriage books actually make our marriages and sex lives worse, not better. But the good news, we'll find out how to change the narrative. Now let's jump right in. And I'm really thrilled to be interviewing today Sheila Gregoire. Did I just say that right?
That's good enough. Sounds very French Canadian. Yes.
Well, I was so blown away by her Twitter feed and the things she said. And I thought, I've got to meet this woman. She's killing it. She's saying things that need to be said. So welcome, Sheila. We are going to be talking today about your new book, The Great Sex Rescue. And so why don't you take it away and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in this whole thing?
Well, I have been blogging for years at to love, honor, and vacuum.com. And I try to say good things about marriage and sex. And here's how you have a great marriage. And here's how you have great sex. And I put out all kinds of content, right? Like I blog every day. I have a podcast. I've got lots of books. But it seemed like no matter how much good content I put out there, everybody still had very similar problems that they couldn't get over. And I started to realize that the issue was not the lack of good content. It was that there was something fundamentally broken in our foundation. And especially our evangelical foundation, the things that were being taught about marriage and sex often lead to really bad outcomes. So I decided, along with my daughter who works on the blog and a statistician who also works on the blog, we decided that we would do the largest survey ever done so far of Christian women's marital and sexual satisfaction. So we surveyed 20,000 people last year. You sent us a ton of people. And so I'm sure a lot of the listeners to this did that survey. So let me say thank you, because I know how long it was.
And it was a long survey.
And if you were divorced taking it, it was even longer. So thank you. But we took the results from that survey and we turned it into a book, The Great Sex Rescue, where we're talking about which evangelical teachings we have now identified seriously wreck sex for women.
Oh, wow. And let me just jump in here and say, normally in sociological studies, these kinds of studies, 800 respondents is considered to be a serious study, but you got 20,000 who answered your survey. And one of the things that really just amazed me is how you discovered that Christian marriage and Christian sex books were actually damaging Christian women's sex life and their marriages rather than making them better. And I mean, that was shocking information to me because I just never really thought about it. We trusted these authors to give us really reliable and godly information. So tell us what you found.
Yeah, well, it all started really, my whole urge to do this started in 2019 in January, when for the very first time I read the book Love and Respect. And I know this is going to sound weird, but as a marriage and sex author, I hadn't actually read a lot of marriage and sex books in the Christian world because I'm really paranoid of plagiarizing. And so I had gone through a decade or so of ministry in this area. My husband and I spoke at marriage conferences. We recommended books, but we never actually read them. We just assumed that they were all good and that they all kind of said the same things that I was saying on my blog because I thought this is what's healthy.
And that's like a best-selling book. I mean, that sold millions of copies. So why couldn't we trust it? Right.
Exactly. And so I read it, and I'm in the Myers-Briggs personality type. I'm an N. I'm not an S. Like, I'm the big picture person. I'm not the detail person. So us N's, we don't necessarily do things in order. So I didn't start in the table of contents and then start reading. I went right to the chapter that mattered the most to me. So I went right to the sex chapter, which is almost at the end of the book. And that's what I read. And I was flabbergasted. It was only about 9 pages long, but the gist of it was, Your husband needs sex and you don't. He said, if your husband is typical, he has a need that you don't have. Sex is about a husband's physical release. If you don't have sex, he'll likely have an affair. And most affairs are caused by women not having sex. And you have to sympathize with his lust problem if you expect him to sympathize with your body image issues.
Oh, that's
and that
crazy.
Was it. That was it. And then in other parts of the book, he talked about a man criticizing his wife's weight, her weight gain. And then she brought up, well, yeah, but you watch porn and you drink. And his response was, she's just trying to deflect and not listening to the criticism. So he just blew off the porn use there.
Yeah. Blowing that
like,
off.
Didn't even,
you caused it. You're deflecting, or, you're the cause of it. If you were more available.
And so we were just flabbergasted by this. And I ended up writing about it on the blog, and I had so many women write in saying that Love and Respect was the book that enabled abuse in their marriage, that made a husband who was once a good guy into really someone who was selfish and was always saying, that she was being disrespectful. And we just heard from hundreds of women over that first week. And we went to Focus on the Family with our results because I thought they'd care. I'd been on Focus on the Family 3 times. I knew Jim Daly, and I thought maybe they just didn't realize this, but they didn't care. They blew us off. And so we decided they can maybe ignore hundreds of women, but they can't ignore 20,000.
Wow.
So we thought that we would just do the biggest study we possibly could and get to the bottom of this.
Well, when you got into this, what did you find? I mean, how do you define a healthy sex life in marriage, and contrast that with what we've either been taught by some of these Christian marriage and sex books, or just society at large?
Okay, well, that's a tricky question because it gets into stats. So there's 2 different answers for it. So I'll tell you the stats answer, and then I'll tell you our findings answer. So for our stats answer, we actually used 2 different previously validated sets of survey questions on marital and sexual satisfaction. And so we used those to measure this, and they asked different things like, how emotionally close do you feel during sex? How would you rate your sex life? Like, I think there were 5 or 6 questions that were previously validated because we were trying to do this with all scientific rigor. But if you look at our findings, what we were really looking for was we had different measures that we were trying to see. So we were looking at how often women reach orgasm as one of our outcome variables, how emotionally close they said that they felt with their husband during sex, their level of sexual pain, because that's something that just isn't talked about in Christian circles. And even though women experience sexual pain in the church at twice the rate of the general population.
Wow.
Yeah, so,
I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, it is. It really is. And yet, we all know what erectile dysfunction means. How many of us even know the word vaginismus?
No, explain that for us.
Yeah. So vaginismus is an involuntary muscle contraction of the vaginal muscles in the vaginal wall, especially sort of the first 1.5 to 2 inches, especially, and it makes penetration very painful, difficult, or even impossible. It is something which is treatable sort of with pelvic floor physiotherapy. That tends to have the most success, but it can be very, it's a tricky thing to deal with.
I mean, when you're telling me that this is distinctly a Christian problem, or it affects us at double the rate, I mean, That's shocking. What's behind that? What causes that?
Well, we have a number of different theories, and that is one thing that we were actually measuring is how different, if you believe certain evangelical teachings, are you more likely to experience vaginismus? And we did find that several teachings definitely increase the odds.
Wow. Could you give us a quick rundown of what those teachings are?
Yeah. One of them, which is the most significant, was you are obligated to give your husband sex when he wants it. So
sex on demand.
We called that our obligation sex message. I believe something like 43% of women who answered our survey said that they were taught this before they were married, and roughly 38 or 39% believed it. Now about half that number believe it today, but before they were married, that's what they believed.
Wow. And the ones who believed it are the ones who really saw the
Yeah.
most deleterious effect.
Yeah, and to put this in perspective, your increased chance of having vaginismus, if you believe that, was very similar to the increased chance of having vaginismus if you had prior abuse.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Okay. So abuse was slightly higher, but not significantly higher. I think there was a 0.1% gap in the overlap of the confidence intervals for anyone who knows anything about stats, but it was very close. So you can imagine that if someone has abuse in the past, that might be something that they might experience vaginismus. But the obligation sex message does something very similar, and our bodies interpret it in a similar way, because what it's saying, just like abuse says, you don't matter. I get to use you.
Mm.
What you want is inconsequential to me. And the obligation sex message says the same thing.
Wow. Oh, that's
You
really
don't
painful
matter.
to hear.
Yeah, you're inconsequential to me. And that is the message that is preached throughout our evangelical books. And so what we did in our book, The Great Sex Rescue, I actually have one here. Hold on just a sec.
Ooh, we want to see it.
Yeah, I just got it just a couple of days ago in the mail. So there it is, The Great
Yay,
Sex Rescue. And
great.
the funny thing
Excellent.
is our covers look so similar for the
I
life-saving
know.
divorce. And
It's
it wasn't even
natural.
intentional. So yeah, look at that. Isn't that funny? They're so similar. Yeah.
I just want to say right up front, I love your cover. I approve of your cover. I think that a life preserver is the perfect image for both of our books. So I'm all in favor. So the first, you said that the first message you found was this obligatory sex. What are the other messages you found?
Other ones that had things like you have to have sex or he's going to watch porn. So just that threat, anything that put a threat to sex. So if you don't do this, he's going to do something else, was negative. We also found, and this is a slightly different issue, but when you're a virgin, when you're both virgins on your wedding night, there is a higher chance of vaginismus. And I think one of the reasons is because we go from 0 to 60 in one night, and there isn't any talk of allowing sexual progression to happen naturally. And so many women don't even know what it is to be aroused, or how to move on, because your body is telling you to, rather than just following the script of what we're supposed to do. And that often can result in really nasty things too.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. Any other big messages that we got that actually cause us pain in sex, which is, I'm still getting over the fact that you just told me that that this affects Christian women at double the rate of secular.
Well, I mean, I should say it's not just Christian. It's religious conservatives. There was a wonderful, Netflix made it into a documentary or a movie. I guess it's not a documentary, but a woman wrote her story, Unorthodox. She was an Orthodox Jew, and then she left the Orthodox faith, and vaginismus was a large part of her story as well. And if you want to understand how it plays out, watching that show Unorthodox, it was one of the best depictions I've ever seen of it, because vaginismus is also part of my story. This is something that I endured as well when I first got married. So I had a special heart for this one. And so if people are wondering what it is, take a look at Unorthodox on Netflix. It was really well done.
So there's something going on in the religious teaching we're getting in religious conservative religious communities that is messing up our sex lives and our ability to connect sexually with our partner, which is what we want to do.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem, again, is defining sex as something which she owes him. Biblically, sex is supposed to be a knowing. You know, Genesis 4 verse 1, Adam knew his wife Eve. We often laugh at that phrasing because we think God was embarrassed of using the real word. But, you know, the Hebrew word to know there is this deep knowing, this deep intimacy, this deep longing to be connected. And God was telling us there that sex is supposed to be more than just physical. So sex is supposed to be a knowing, but our evangelical resources and our evangelical teaching has turned sex into an owing, where women owe sex to men. And it's just very damaging all the way around, because it sees sex also entirely as a male entitlement, and it sees sex from the male viewpoint and leaves women almost completely out of it.
Yeah. And you know, we've talked about this before, but the Jewish understanding of sexuality really required the man to make sex intimate and pleasing to her.
Mm-hmm.
Marital rape
Mm-hmm.
was not acceptable in ancient Jewish teaching, and nor is it today. So, somehow we've gotten really off track. Now, let me ask you something. A lot of Christian women might not use the word abuse for the sexual relationship they have with their husband, but they can say, my husband pressures me for sex. They sort of bribe me. I hear this in the Life Saving Divorce private group. I just knew that if I wanted the get together that evening to go well, I'd better give him sex this afternoon, because otherwise he was just going to be, he was going to behave badly. And then punishing them when they would be, when they didn't feel good or didn't want to have sex, or criticizing them sexually, comparing them to, other people. So let me ask you this. Where does it cross the line? Where is it abusive?
I would say we just need to get back to the idea of consent and truly understand what consent means. When we looked at our evangelical resources, we chose the 10 best-selling marriage books and then the most iconic and important sex books. Out of the 10 best-selling marriage books, 3 of them didn't talk about sex. So we had 6 sex books. So altogether, we had 13 evangelical books that we looked at in detail, and we measured on a rubric of 12 markers of healthy female sexuality. We also looked at John Gottman, who is a secular researcher from the Gottman Institute. We looked at his book, The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work, sort of as our control book, to see how the best-selling secular book handled things. John Gottman was the only book that we looked at that even said the word consent.
Wow. Oh, wow. Okay. That's serious.
Now, some books like Boundaries in Marriage, definitely, it didn't say consent, but the whole point of Boundaries in Marriage is that you're allowed to have boundaries. So I'm not saying that all of our books that we looked at supported marital rape, although some definitely did. But consent is a missing conversation in the evangelical world. And if you can't freely say no, there is no possibility of freely saying yes. So if your husband is grumpy if you don't have sex, if he yells at the kids less if you do have sex, if he is nicer to guests if you have sex, if he gives you the silent treatment for a week if you don't have sex, that is all taking away consent from you. That is not what sex is meant to be. There is a big misuse of the Bible verses 1 Corinthians 7, 3-5 in most of our literature. And those verses talk about how the husband has to fulfill the wife's his marital duties as wife. The wife has to fulfill hers to their husband. Her body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. His body does not belong to him alone, but also to the wife, and do not deprive each other, except by mutual consent and for a time for prayer and fasting, and then come together again. And we use those verses, do not deprive each other, to say to women that he has a need that you need to fulfill. And that is not an appropriate use of those verses for so many reasons. But the first one is just a foundational definitional one, which is, what do we mean by sex? Like, if I were to ask you, which I won't, but if I were to ask you to define sex, or if I were to say to you, did you have sex last night? Like, you're picturing something in your head, right? And what you're picturing, probably what you think I'm asking is, did he put his penis into her vagina and move around until he climaxed? Like, that's how we tend to define sex. The problem with that is that it leaves women entirely out of the equation. Because she may not be enjoying it. She could just be lying there. She could be counting ceiling tiles. She could be making up her grocery list. Like, it leaves her completely out. And what we found too in our survey is that the vast majority of women who can reach orgasm do not do so through intercourse alone.
Wow. Okay.
And now some can. I think it's like I'm guessing at the number. I'm saying 30%. It might be 34. It might be 32, but somewhere around there. There's so many numbers in this thing. I can't remember them all. That was what Joanna, our statistician, was. But it was something like a third of women who could reach orgasm could reach it through through intercourse alone, but everybody else needed other stuff. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of women, that other stuff is a more reliable way of reaching orgasm. So when we define sex as simply intercourse, we're defining sex in terms of whether or not he reaches climax. And her climax can be seen as like it's a bonus, it's an extra, it's an afterthought, but it's certainly not necessary. So we're prioritizing his experience. And the Bible never, ever does that. The whole purpose of the 1 Corinthians 7 passage is that it's completely mutual. Everything that he gets, she gets too. And in fact, her sexual needs are mentioned before his.
Wow. I never noticed that before.
Yeah. And in Roman times, husbands had complete authority over their wives' bodies to the extent that they could murder their wives. And that would be okay. And so for the Apostle Paul to say that the wife has authority over her husband's body was really quite revolutionary. And this is actually the only passage where it talks about authority in marriage. And that authority is, yeah, that, of course, people may say, well, yes, but it says that the husband is the head of the wife. But if you look at the Greek word for head there, Paul deliberately does not use the word that connotates authority. He uses a different form of that word. Got it. So the only place where we actually see authority in marriage being talked about is in this passage, and there it's completely mutual. Anything that he has, she has as well.
That's amazing insight. But I just want to sit on that for a second. That is an amazing insight. Because a lot of women are just told this is a one-way street. And the idea of asking for, pleasurable sexual contact is the furthest thing from their mind. They don't even think they have the ability to ask for that. And that's really missing out on, for those of us who really do love sex and do love that closeness, the idea that it's a one-way street is really pretty miserable. And so keep going.
Yeah. And so first of all, we need to define sex the way the Bible does, which is something which is mutual, something which is intimate, that intimate knowing, and something which is pleasurable. So when the Bible says do not deprive each other, it's talking about do not deprive each other of this mutual, pleasurable, intimate experience. Nice. It is not talking about do not deprive each other of one-sided intercourse. Because if you're having one-sided intercourse, you are de facto already being deprived.
Wow.
So, that is not what that Bible verse should ever be used for. And yet over and over again, our evangelical resources have said to women, unless you are praying or fasting, you have no reason to say no. In fact, Kevin Lehman in sheet music even says that during the postpartum phase or during her period, if she can't have intercourse, she should be providing hand jobs or oral sex. So that he can get through this difficult time for him. So he's defining her period and her postpartum recovery as being a difficult time for the husband.
Wow. And not difficult for her.
Yeah.
I mean,
just want to smack him. Anyway. Yeah, I should be nicer than that. I'm sorry. But anyway, more professional, but there's problems with that.
I mean, just the cluelessness of that is really pretty shocking.
So when we get back to that 1 Corinthians 7 passage, first of all, it's not talking about one-sided intercourse, but the other thing is, what does it mean to not deprive? It doesn't mean do not refuse. It doesn't mean you can't say no. Like if your son comes to you at 4:30 in the afternoon and says, can I have some Cheetos? And you say no, you're not depriving him of food. Right? Like dinner's in half an hour and his need is for a healthy, balanced diet. His need is not to eat whenever he wants. And yet the way that our evangelical resources talk about this, it's that every time he wants to have sex or every time he has a sexual urge, he should get that fulfilled. And that isn't the way that the Bible talks about sex.
So what other Bible verses really do a number on our sexuality as Christians or as religious conservatives?
I just think that there's a lot of verses about marriage, about wives submit to your husbands, and those verses are used so much to tell women that whatever he wants, you're there to provide it. We see that especially too with the verse in Genesis about being his helpmeet. This is something which helps him. This builds him up. Have more sex with him so that he feels amazing. And it's true, but it's such a shallow view of sex. And the more we see sex as something which we need to give him and not something which benefits us too, and something which is truly intimate, the more we steal from ourselves what sex was meant to be. And the more we allow selfishness to blossom. I think that's what's really missing, actually. It is God's design for us is that we be transformed into the likeness of Jesus, right? Romans 8:29, he has predestined us to be transformed into the likeness of his son. He wants us to look more and more like Jesus every day. How does telling a man every time you get the urge for some nookie, you can just use your wife no matter how she's feeling, how does that encourage him to look like Christ?
Right.
It's telling him channel all of your needs for intimacy and emotional connection into sex. So you don't have to work on conversation. You don't have to work on relationship. You don't have to work on truly connecting at a heart level. All you really need is ejaculation. I mean, that's what Emerson Eggerichs says.
Wow.
He says husbands need physical release just like wives need emotional release. I have no idea what emotional release is supposed to be, but that's what he said. So wives need that emotional connection, but all husbands need is ejaculation. Like, there's a real problem there with the lack of emotional insight and maturity that they're expecting out of men.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. And this is one of the things I've loved about following you on Twitter. Basically, when you tell a man that he gets anything he wants, anytime he wants it, you're setting up men to become really immature little spoiled brats.
Mm-hmm.
They're not
Mm-hmm.
growing up in Christ. They're not becoming mature. And furthermore, if we continue this path, they also don't mature in business. They don't mature in leadership. They don't mature as coworkers or as executives or managers. They just learn nothing more than my way or the highway. Give me what I want. I'm in charge. And nobody wants to be around a person like that. I mean, yeah. I once asked my son, a little off topic here, but I once asked my son, would you want to marry a girl who had never, whose parents had never told her no ever in their life? They'd never stopped her from doing things. They'd never told her she was wrong about anything she did. And he said, oh my goodness. I mean, she'd be a nightmare. She'd be a disaster to date and marry. And I said, that's kind of what's happening here in the dynamics that we're being taught in our churches about men and women. We're giving this carte blanche to men to treat their wives in any way they want to and just be bullies. Be manipulative, be coercive. And so what ends up happening is if it goes far enough, they end up in my group, the Life Saving Divorce Private group, because, that's not how God wants us to be treated. And we see that all through the entire Bible, from Abraham and Moses to Jesus and Paul. So anyway, go for it.
Yeah, there is one thing I want to say is that one of our big aims when we were doing this survey was we really, really wanted to include divorced women in the survey, because often when surveys have been done of marriages and what works with marriage, we don't survey those who have been divorced. And to me, it's the group that's been divorced who's been hurt the most. So we really wanted to make sure that the divorced women were a large cohort. We didn't get as many as we were hoping. I was hoping for 20%. It ended up being 16. So that was close, but we were quite passionate about that. And I don't know if it's because of that or what, but one of the things that really blew us away was how many people had stories of marital rape. About 20% of our survey respondents left their email addresses so that we could contact them for focus groups. And when we did do that, 20% of those people said that they had stories of marital rape to share with us. So that's not completely scientific because it's a self-selected group, but it still was a very large one.
Wow.
Which we found really heart-wrenching. And we did do some focus groups with some women who had those stories. Most of them, well, I think all of them that we talked about, it was in a previous marriage. But what we heard again and again from those women was that they did not have a word for what was happening to them until they were divorced.
Oh,
Many
wow.
women said it was actually my divorce lawyer who told me that was rape. And this was a woman who had fled to the bathroom, would lock herself in her room, would hide in the bottom of the closet, like literally hiding to get away from her husband. But she just didn't realize there could be rape in marriage.
Yeah. It's amazing how many stories I hear in my group.
Mm-hmm.
It's unbelievable. And, that's a disaster. That's really a disaster because that is absolutely a form of physical abuse. That's sexual abuse. And, in our next video, I want to talk about sexual trauma and things like that. But now that you have analyzed, and I want to spend a little bit more time on this because you have analyzed all the top marriage and sex books that, especially those in the Christian world. I want you to tell us a little bit more about that. And then I want you to tell us how your views have changed over time and what teachings on your blog or in your books would you rewritten or reconsidered or thought through with this brand new knowledge?
Yeah. One of the things that we're quite adamant about in the Great Sex Rescue is that you're allowed to grow. And I tried really hard in the book to mention, I think, 3 specific places where I had changed my mind on something, because we don't know everything right off the bat. And I think we do need to give people the chance to grow. Even on my blog, I've done that. Or 2 months ago, I put up a podcast and I said something wrong and it was just a mess. And so I took the podcast down, because that's what we should be doing. When we say something wrong, we should own that and we need to apologize. I used to recommend I Kiss Dating Goodbye. I was like, purity culture.
I did too.
Let's do it. And then when my girls got to be like 16, 17, I realized what a disaster that book was. And so I started talking about how I no longer recommended it. And that I think is healthy. So when I'm upset at authors, it's not that I think we should never listen to them again. I'm just asking them to apologize or to change what they're saying. And I'm trying to point out that these things are problematic. I don't expect anyone to be perfect. I'm not perfect, and in the academic world, which really is the world that I perhaps am a little more comfortable with. I've done postgraduate work. A lot of my family is in academia. My husband's in academia. My co-authors, they were in academia too. So that's the world that we are most comfortable with. And in academia, what happens is someone comes up with an idea and they write a paper on it. And then everybody writes papers saying why that idea is wrong. And they wrestle it through until they come up with a better idea. And then people take that idea down. And that's normal. Like, it's normal to say, hey, I don't think that's actually true, or maybe you got this part right, but could this be an alternate explanation? And then people talk about it. In the Christian world, you're not allowed to say anybody's wrong. I mean, when we started talking out about love and respect, people thought I was so mean, and people would say, well, did you go to Emerson Eggerichs first before you took it public? This isn't a personal sin. He hasn't sinned against me. This is about false teaching. And false teaching is supposed to be confronted in public, which is the biblical model. That's what Paul did with Peter, and that's when Paul called out a ton of false teachers in his epistles, because if the teaching's been done in public, it needs to be corrected in public. But in the Christian world, that's seen as you're not supposed to do that. And especially as a woman, you're not supposed to do that to men. And in this book, we are just calling a spade for everybody.
Yeah, because you criticize women's books too. I mean,
absolutely.
Books by women authors, I should say. Right.
Yes, absolutely. But again, I just want to stress we're not asking for anyone to be perfect. And you asked some of the things that I've changed. One of the really interesting stats, and Joanna, our stats person, she totally geeked out over this one and ran it several different ways because we found it so fascinating. Sexless marriages. If you look at marriages where sex happens extremely rarely or never, there's 5 key elements that tend to be present. So either anorgasmia, so she never has an orgasm, she doesn't feel close during sex, he's watching porn, he has really bad sexual dysfunction of some sort, or they're just really emotionally disconnected in marriage. Okay, so those 5 things. When you look at sexless marriages, 75% of them have at least 2 of those issues.
Mm.
But in marriages where sex is really frequent, the vast majority have none.
Oh, wow.
And so when we're looking at sexless marriages, the way that it is framed, and the way that I've done it in the past too, is, sex is an integral part of marriage. You're not allowed to just not have sex. Like, you can't just take it off the table forever like that. You just can't do that. But now that I've looked at this, I realized, hold on a second. In the vast majority of these relationships, there's other stuff going on. Relationships don't turn sexless just because a woman says, nah, I don't really like sex.
Right. It's not because she's cold or frigid. She's
Right.
being betrayed or there's something really horrible going on in that marriage.
Right. And so one of the big things we've said in the book is we need to stop seeing frequency as the problem and start seeing it as a symptom.
Mm.
When things aren't going right in other parts of your relationship, it's going to show up in frequency, but simply turning up the frequency is not going to fix those other areas. And so we need to address his porn use. We need to address the fact that she feels completely emotionally distant from him.
So that pastor who said, the whole solution to this is having sex every day for 30 days. Mm-hmm. What would you say to him?
That he doesn't even understand women's motivations or why they say no. Like, to say the solution is to have sex for 30 days when that is all that you say is a huge problem, because sex, the way that we define it, tends to be that one-sided intercourse that we talked about. I would really love to see a big name pastor address the 47-point orgasm gap that we have.
Wow. 47 points.
47 points. So 48% of women almost always reach orgasm during a sexual encounter, but 95% of men do.
Oh, wow.
So when we're talking about who is deprived, it doesn't tend, well, again, we're focusing on frequency, but in the sexless marriages section, we actually talked about something which we called sexless marriage in disguise, which is, if you've been having sex for years, but she's never had an orgasm and she feels emotionally distant from her husband, that's a sexless marriage in disguise, even if sex is still happening 2 to 3 times a week.
Oh, wow.
Because she is being completely deprived. And yet that wouldn't show up as there being anything wrong with that sex life, because we tend to measure sex as only about frequency. And so when you tell women you just need to have sex every day for 30 days, but you don't address the orgasm gap, it does nothing. It does nothing.
What kind of sex life do you wish every woman had?
I wish that she felt total freedom in the bedroom, and that she felt cherished, and that she didn't feel like she was broken, or that she was a bother. Because what happens, I think, is so many women feel like, I'm selfish, I'm a bother. If I need to ask him to do something to me to make me feel good, then it's just because my body doesn't work right. And we feel so much shame, like there's something inherently wrong with us, because he can climax in 5 minutes and we take 20 or 25 if we do it all. Right? And often much longer than that. So we start thinking, I'm broken. And we start feeling all kinds of shame. And we start feeling like this just isn't for me. And what I wish is that couples could realize, hey, there's a reason that women take longer than men. God made women that way because sex is the time when men get to serve women.
Wow.
And so, ladies, let him serve you, because that's the way you were designed. The
Yes.
clitoris is on the outside of the vagina. It doesn't get maximum stimulation from intercourse. It gets maximum stimulation from him doing something else to you. And that's the way you were made. You're not broken. It's just that we don't understand that our needs matter too.
Yeah, and I think that there'd be a lot of men who aren't these entitled people who just take advantage of you. Although some would be, whether you spoke up or not. But we have a hard time saying, this is what I want. Do it this way. Touch me this way. Touch me here. No, do that a few more minutes. And, we just don't think that we should or that we can. And it's so important, especially for those of us who do like sex. And what you've just told me is that women who don't like sex, there's probably another issue going on. And so, we need to speak up more. I'm not blaming this problem on us, but I love what you said about 1 Corinthians 7, that the man is also supposed to please us. He's not to deprive us of really a loving, sexually fulfilling relationship.
Yeah. And, it's interesting what you said about speaking up, because what so many of the books tell us, like For Women Only, for instance, by Shanti Feldon, says that what he needs to know is that you enjoy this and you want this. And because he's not going to feel sexually fulfilled, or he's not going to feel love through sex unless he knows that you're really excited about it too. And so you need to communicate your excitement to him, and you need to let your words be heart words and be enthusiastic about it. But she never says that it should actually feel good for you. She just says you need to always praise him in the bedroom. And then she does have this offhand comment, like, if it's not feeling good for you, you should see a counselor. But she never says, if it's not feeling good for you, you should talk to your husband.
Right. You have to pretend and fake it.
Yeah. I mean, she doesn't outwardly say fake it. She does acknowledge that, if you can't sexually respond, at least, encourage him and be excited about it or whatever. Like, she doesn't actually, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I found that section really problematic because, and she wasn't the only one to say this. His needs, her needs said something really similar. Like, he won't enjoy sex unless you do. And so you need to enjoy sex for his sake. Like, if you
weird.
don't enjoy it, like, if you don't enjoy it, if you don't tell him you enjoy it, then you're depriving him of what he really needs. And so it's like, women are incentivized to think, okay, not only do I have to give him sex, I have to act like I enjoy it. But they're not incentivized to ever say, this is what I actually need you to do. Because if we do that, then we're being disrespectful. We're telling him he's not a good lover, all of these other things.
Right. We're being selfish. We've walked outside our lane because we're supposed to be there only to serve. None of our needs and wishes and emotions really matter.
Yeah. Yeah. And all of the books do a great job of saying, that what women really need is communication, and they need to talk. And guys, you should be talking to her if you want her to have sex with you. But it's like, women were made for orgasm too. And so few of the books even talk about that. Our sex books do, but our marriage books really don't. Our marriage books just frame this as he needs to have sex and you need to talk. And if you each give each other what they need, then you'll be fine.
So tell us about your book. How do you fill in that gap of information that's missing in our Christian marriage books? And also tell us where we can buy it.
Yeah, well, what we did was we took all of the individual teachings. We looked at, where, like, all men struggle with lust. It's every man's battle. Boys will want to push your boundaries. And so you need to be the gatekeeper. Like, we looked at all of these messages that are throughout our resources. We gave lots of quotes so that you'll relate to it. And then we showed how you can reframe them. So, for instance, instead of saying all men struggle with lust, it's every man's battle, you can say, many people struggle with lust, often men more than women, but many women too, and many of us are visually stimulated and we struggle with lust. But Jesus says that this is not a struggle that is going to be ongoing or that you can't overcome. And the way that you overcome it is to respect everybody as whole people made in the image of God. It's quite
Yep.
simple. You just bring it back to the Bible. You bring it back to Jesus. What our books do, though, instead, is they put all of the responsibility on women. So the way that you get over men lusting is for women to have sex more. Every Man's Battle literally calls us the methadone for our husband's porn addictions.
And methadone, just so people don't realize, methadone is a antidote to an opioid addiction, correct? So they're equating an porn use or lust problems with an opioid addiction. And yeah, we're not just the antidote to their addictions.
Right. And to make it even worse, methadone is like a substitute, but it's not what you really want. So by calling women methadone, it's like saying, we know what he really wants is to watch that hot woman have sex and masturbate to that. But he'll settle for you as a substitute so that he's not as tempted to watch what he really wants to see.
Ouch. Ooh, okay. I never really understood that. When I saw that quote over and over. I've seen it, you use it on Twitter all the time, and I didn't understand what that really meant. Wow, that's powerful. So give us some more reframing, don't say it this way, say it this way, because I love that in your book.
Okay. Well, instead of saying, do not refuse to have sex, say God created sex to be mutual, pleasurable, and intimate. And that should be a really important part, a really important life-giving part of your marriage. And if it isn't, then let's figure out why.
Oh, I love that. That's much more affirming. That's excellent. Give us another one.
Well, instead of saying boys will want to push girls' sexual boundaries, you can say sex feels good. And when you're in a relationship, you're naturally going to have sexual feelings for each other. But remember that it is crucial to always abide by someone else's boundaries. And if someone is not paying attention to your boundaries, that's a red flag that you should get out of the relationship.
I want to jump into that because in what I do in the Life Saving Divorce and my private group, I also speak to men, because there are men whose wives or girlfriends before they get married cross their sexual boundaries. The man will actually say, no, I don't want to do this before marriage. And a woman will actually coerce and manipulate him to cross his boundaries. So it can go both ways, although I know that women are usually the victim of this sort of thing.
But that is really important to say. And that's something else that was a big theme in our book, is that the vast majority of our evangelical resources are gendered, meaning that they make huge gender stereotypes about everything from, a man needs this, a woman needs this, men have the high libido, women have the low libido. Okay, in 60% of marriages, yes, but in 20% they have the same libido, and in 20% she has the higher libido.
Yeah, there's so little nuance in so many issues.
Yeah, and we need to get away from making everything about gender in marriage. Marriage is about intimacy. It's about two people truly seeing who the other is. When we make things about gender, we're asking people to fulfill roles and put on masks, and it's no longer about intimacy then. It's about how well do you fulfill your role or your mask, and then I don't really know you.
Right, because you're having to play into a certain role, and then your pretend role tries to interact with his pretend role. And how do you know you've got intimacy with that actual person, what they actually want, rather than what they've been told as a man they must want? It is kind of, it makes the marriage way too complex. Why can we not love this particular person's character, this particular personality type, this particular their particular traits, rather than some label, of a certain type of man, a certain type of woman? It doesn't make any sense to me either.
Yeah. So I just hope that as people read The Great Sex Rescue, that they'll feel validated. I know a lot of your listeners, they have gone through a life-saving divorce, and they were really hurt by a lot of these teachings. And I hope, even if people aren't married, I think it's a great book just to realize I wasn't crazy. Like,
Mm,
this stuff really is toxic. And all of the stuff I read and believed, it wasn't my fault that I believed that. It wasn't like I was some terrible pushover who didn't know how to stand up for myself. I was primed to do this.
right. We were told from the day we heard
Yeah.
messages from the day we were born about what
Hmm.
sexuality should be like. And it's not our fault that we believed them because, that was the
Yeah.
world we were brought up in. I can see
Yeah.
three different or several different um, audiences for this. Man, I definitely want to go over this with my children. Second, just talk it through with them. Second, for people who want, in my group, who want to remarry and they want sex
Hmm.
to be better. I mean, sometimes when I talk about my marriage, so I remarried after my divorce, and they can't believe that I'm not afraid. They can't believe that this is a warm, supportive, encouraging relationship. They can't believe that I might be angry with something or be frustrated with something, and there's no price to pay for that. With a healthy relationship, you're loved and cared for and encouraged.
Yeah.
And if you say, honey, I just need a little bit more time with sex. I just need more time. I need you to do this or do that.
Yeah.
Um, that a loving spouse will say, no problem. I'm here for you. I love you. I care about you. And
Hmm.
I'm here to do my best to meet your needs. And so I want women to realize that just because they had a really bad, destructive relationship in their first marriage, that doesn't mean that they are set up to have the same thing
Hmm.
happen in their second. I know there's a
Hmm.
mythology that says, well, if you failed in your first marriage, your second, what's the difference in your second marriage? You're the common denominator, so you're going to fail in your second marriage too. And that's just not always true. A lot of it has to do with having a loving, supportive, nurturing partner who actually does care about your well-being, who has your best interest at heart. And that's not always what we got in our first marriages. So anyway,
Yeah.
those are kind of the people I really want to promote your
Yeah.
book to, as well as those who are just trying to sort it out. They're going through a divorce now, or they're single after
Hmm.
divorce. What happened to me? What
Yeah.
caused this to happen? So anyway, I'm really grateful. Any parting shots on this?
I think when you're reading it, it's kind of like watching a train wreck. Like, you can't look away. It's just so awful. You can't look away. And that's what it's like as you read story after story and quote after quote from all these terrible books. But in the end, just grab some popcorn, grab a tea, and just read it. It's like, no, they didn't say that. Oh, yes. And if you thought that was bad, just wait till the next chapter. Um, but I think it's also a really hopeful book because we bring it all back to the cross. We bring it all back to Jesus, and we show that even if sex was used as a weapon against you, that was never God's intention.
Mm,
God was never wanting you to be used, and
mm.
you are precious to him. And what God really wanted was real intimacy for you. And if that was something you never experienced, if sex was turned into something that was the exact opposite, I just want people to know that wasn't of Jesus.
Oh, I'm so glad you said it that way. I mean, that's just really, really powerful. Now, your book is available when? How
March
soon?
2nd. And I also do have, just for a listener bonus for listening into this podcast, we have our full rubric, our 12-point rubric of healthy sexuality teaching and our scorecard. And you can download that. I'll give you the link and you can put it in the description box for this
Oh,
so
this
that
thing is
people can
so
go and
valuable.
download it.
I love
Mm-hmm.
these comparison charts, and you sent me one in advance, and I think I emailed you and said, how soon can I put this up? Until they see this comparison chart of all the books, and they see your criteria for what makes a teaching good or not good in each particular topic, they won't really understand how much work you've gone to, and it is really powerful. I think you're going to open up the eyes of a lot of people, and I just pray for better marriages and better sex lives in Christian couples.
Yeah. And can we please have people who don't know what they're talking about stop writing about sex?
and you mentioned you came from the academic world. Well, I came from the publishing world. I know how easy it is to change a book. These books, even the bestsellers, usually go on press a minimum of once a year. And that means at any time, any year, and probably more sooner than that, any of these books could have been changed and still can be changed. And people love, the new revised, updated version. So I would really strongly encourage the other authors to change change it. Apologize and change it, because we're not looking to tear you down. We're looking to have better teaching so that Christians have great marriages and great sex lives. So
Amen.
Anyway,
Amen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.